Story 1. Some jobs feel heavier at night, not because of the work itself, but because of the silence that comes with it. Cleaning the church was one of those jobs. During the day, the place felt almost alive, but at night, it was different. A silence so deep it pressed against your ears. That silence became a kind of company. At least that's what I told myself to get through the night shifts. The church had an attic above the main hall, mostly used for storage. Old furniture, broken hymnals, and a piano that I assumed didn't work anymore. Nobody touched it, nobody mentioned it. The thing just sat up there collecting dust, so out of place that I wondered why they hadn't just hauled it off years ago. One night, while I was mopping the main floor, I heard music. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the way sounds bounce around in old buildings. But the sound grew clearer, the distinct keys of a piano being pressed in a steady rhythm. It was soft, not loud or jarring, almost like someone was practicing. I froze mid-step, mop in hand, because there was no reason anyone should have been upstairs. I tried to brush it off as a leftover echo, maybe something mechanical, but the longer I stood there, the more undeniable it became. The melody wasn't random. It sounded deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, was upstairs was playing. My first instinct was to think someone had broken in. Maybe some kid decided to prank me, or a homeless person found their way into the building. I grabbed my flashlight and headed up the narrow staircase, each step creaking louder than I remembered. The closer I got, the clearer the music became. By the time I reached the landing, it suddenly stopped. Dead silence, like it had never happened. I shined the flashlight across the attic. Just piles of dusty boxes, stacks of chairs, and that piano in the corner. The lid was closed, untouched. No footprints in the dust, no sign of movement. I stood there, my pulse hammering in my ears, telling myself I'd scared whoever it was away. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. There was no one up there. I decided to head back down and finish my shift. But before I turned to leave, something slammed hard against the metal door on the far side of the attic. It was so loud it rattled through my chest. The door led to a small storage closet that I never once had a reason to open. I froze, staring at it, waiting for the sound again. Nothing. Just silence, heavier than before. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, and for once I listened. I left the mop bucket where it was, grabbed my things, and walked out. Didn't even bother to lock the back door. The church had never felt so unfriendly. I told myself the next day it was probably something logical. The piano strings shifting with temperature, maybe? Or the metal door expanding in the frame? Old buildings make weird noises, right? That's the line I used on myself. But the problem is, those explanations don't account for the fact that I heard music. Not random notes, actual music, played like someone knew what they were doing. I never took another night shift after that. I stayed on for a few more weeks, working during the day, but every time I walked past the attic stairs, I felt that same tight pull in my stomach, like the place was daring me to go back up. I never did. To this day, I can't say for sure what I experienced. A part of me wants to believe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. Another part knows what I heard was real, whether it was a person, something paranormal, or just my own brain trying to mess with me. I'll never know. All I know is that the church stopped feeling like a church that night. It felt like something else had taken ownership of the silence. Story 2. The hallway felt like the inside of a clock at night. Everything was supposed to be still and orderly, but you could almost hear the gears clicking if you listened close enough. That's the picture I keep when I think back to that night at the middle school. The way routine becomes its own kind of noise until something breaks the pattern and the quiet seems wrong. I worked the night custodial shift for a while, cleaning the same long U-shaped wing 5 nights a week. It was the same loop every time. Sweep, mop, wipe down desks, empty trash, check lights. The wing was empty during the day and felt empty at night too, but empty in a different way. More like the kind of empty that watches you. I'd been alone on that shift for months and learned every squeak and hum the building made. So when something went out of the ordinary, I noticed it right away. That night, I started like any other. I timed my rounds so I could hit the whole U before the other janitor left, and by the time I reached the middle of my loop, I had already locked the first set of doors that connected the wing to the rest of the school. The fluorescent lights buzzed in that soft, mechanical way they always did. Some classrooms had leftover drawings on the boards, chairs stacked on desks, backpacks still slumped in corners. Little traces that made it obvious kids had been there earlier. I checked the bathrooms, made sure faucets weren't leaking, and wiped fingerprints off the glass on the classroom doors. The whole place smelled faintly of markers and old gym floor polish. Nothing felt off, not until I rounded the last curve and headed toward the end of the hallway, where the doors to the rest of the school sat. There were little things that made my skin crawl that night before the silhouette even showed up. The clock over the gym door was 5 minutes slow, which threw me because I'd set that clock myself the week before. One of the exit signs at the far end hummed louder than normal and gave off a faint, cold draft that I could feel on the back of my neck. The metal wastebasket in room 12 was knocked over, even though I was sure I'd left it upright the last time I was there. I remember thinking the lights looked a little colder than usual, like the bulbs had shifted tone, making shadows longer and edges harder. Those were small, explainable things, old building stuff, but they built up in my head, and by the time I reached the end of the wing, I was already a little keyed up. I made the final lap and turned off the lights in the last classroom. The hallway went from a dull glow to pure dark, the way it always did when the fluorescents clicked off. My vision adjusted, and the emergency lighting gave off that low orange halo. That's when I saw it, a dark silhouette that moved fast across the end of the hallway, from left to right, like someone sprinting just beyond the glow. It had the shape of a small person, definitely child-sized, but it wasn't solid the way a person usually looks in dim light. It was just a cutout of darkness, like someone had taken a shadow and given it form. There were doors along that end of the hall, doors I had locked myself, and I had walked the whole wing twice that night. No one should have been there. The sight of it hit me like cold water. My first stupid thought was that a kid must have slipped in through another entrance, but then I remembered locking those connecting doors and doing the key sweep myself. Panic moved through my chest fast enough that I could taste metal. I didn't hear any footsteps, no scuffle, no sound of clothing. The silhouette didn't slow or hesitate. It ran smooth and straight, disappearing behind the last custodial closet as if it had slipped through a crack. I stood frozen for a full minute, every nerve screaming to move, and I had the ridiculous urge to check my watch even though my phone was in the car. My hands shook so badly I could barely zip my tool pouch. I ran to the door that connected the wing to the main building and locked it out of reflex, heart pounding the whole time. It felt like the right thing to do. I pushed the deadbolt in place and clicked it twice just to be sure. The corridor behind me was quiet enough to hear the HVAC kicking on. I don't remember thinking about the other janitor or calling someone. The rational thing would have been to radio dispatch or at least walk to the office, but my muscles didn't listen to reason. I grabbed my jacket and went straight for my car. I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole way, half expecting to see that small shadow waiting at the windows. Nothing showed. Everything looked ordinary, except for the way my breath looked flushed in the cold air, even though it wasn't that cold outside. I didn't stick around to be brave. I started the engine and sat there for a long time with the lights off, telling myself it was probably a kid messing around or a trick of light. Maybe someone else was working late and I'd missed them. Maybe I'd imagined the silhouette because I'd been alone too long. The janitorial staff joked that those old buildings play tricks on your eyes. That was the sensible narrative I wanted to believe. But the thing that kept me from going back in the next morning wasn't the sight itself. It was the way the silhouette had moved with purpose, like it knew the hall better than I did. It wasn't running in panic or hiding, it was heading somewhere. After that night, I switched shifts whenever I could. I called in a couple of sick days. I started leaving 5 minutes earlier than needed and made excuses whenever someone scheduled me on the U-Wing overnight. I told myself it was stress, the result of doing the same loop until your mind starts filling blanks where nothing is. But every time I walked past that end of the hallway during the day, I felt a small, cold prickle. Teachers would laugh and say schools are full of energy and that kids run in their sleep and project onto rooms. Maybe that's true. Maybe some kid had snuck back in with a dare. Or maybe I'd seen a trick of perspective, a mannequin, the shadow of a mop handle. The rational answers all fit if you arrange them just right. The last thing that keeps the memory alive is how simple the whole thing was. There wasn't a dramatic buildup of banging doors or voices. No apparent threat followed me to my car. It was one sharp, impossible image that happened in a hallway I'd walked 1,000 times. That simple, clear cutout of a child running through a place I'd locked. If it was a trespasser, how did they get in and out without so much as a whisper? If it was a trick of the light, why did it look so precise and deliberate? I haven't worked that night shift since. Sometimes I tell the story, and people laugh it off as nerves or stress. Other times, they go quiet and say they've seen things in old buildings too. I don't have an answer, and that's the thing that stuck with me. I saw something I can't explain, and it changed how I walk down empty hallways at night. Story 3. The night shift at that hotel felt like being inside a humming refrigerator. Constant low noise, the same cold air pushed around, and a kind of dead calm that makes every small sound feel huge. I worked there right out of high school, assigned to the overnight laundry most nights, but I would help the front desk with invoices and late check-ins when they needed a hand. It was the kind of place that ran on autopilot after midnight. Guests asleep, lights dimmed in the hallways, the elevators pinging rarely. I didn't expect anything weird to happen in a job like that, but that night is one I still think about because it was so small and so clear, and because there was no good answer for it. I remember the details because nothing else happened there for the 8 months I worked that job, so my mind kept the memory neat and raw. It was around 2 in the morning. I'm not even sure of the exact time. That's part of the oddness. And I was on the 3rd floor sliding an invoice under a door. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaner and had that particular hotel smell. Warm fabric, a little bleach, carpet shampoo. The lights overhead buzzed a bit, the way fluorescent bulbs do when they're getting old. I had taken that route 100 times. The doors on that floor were heavy, solid things that made a loud, hollow thud when you opened them. You could hear footsteps through the thin drywall, tempers, late-night TV voices, the clink of suitcases. Usually the security camera in the lobby picked up every entrance and exit, and the night staff watched the feed if something odd happened. That night I bent to slide the paper under the door, and out of nowhere a pen shot past my face and smacked against the door. It wasn't tossed gently or rolled. It flew like someone had thrown it across the hall. I ducked instinctively and stood up so fast I almost dropped the invoice. For a second, I was convinced someone had opened the door inside that room and launched it out as a joke, or maybe some guest was leaning in with a prank. I stepped back, scanned the hall, but there was no movement, no shadow slipping away, nothing that would explain it. It was silent. No door had opened, no distant laugh, nothing that would normally follow a tossed object in a place where doors creak off the frame and people make noise. I checked my pockets to make sure I hadn't somehow brushed the pen loose from my shirt. I didn't keep pens on me. I looked around the corner where the stairs were, half expecting to see a kid or someone leaning out a doorway with a grin. But the stairwell was empty and the carpet was pressed flat from the same few footsteps it always showed. The hallway cameras didn't show any movement either when I later went downstairs and asked my coworker to check. He said he hadn't been paying close attention to the security screen. That was the odd thing. The feed didn't flag anything unusual because he wasn't watching it, so that route didn't give me answers. When I told him about the pen, he assumed someone inside the room had tossed it out the door, or maybe a gust of air had whipped it from a cart. That sounded plausible at first, and I wanted to believe it, but no drawer was open, no housekeeping cart was around, and there was no draft strong enough to hurl a pen with that force. There were small things that night that stacked up to make the whole moment stick in my head. The vending machine by the laundry room had been cold, like it was powered down, even though the indicator lights showed it on. An emergency exit sign flickered once as I walked past, and for a second, the hallway felt like it tilted slightly, like you get on a boat when it rocks and your stomach disagrees with the motion. The laundry machines hummed in their low, constant rhythm, but there was a shorter, higher sound too, like metal ticking somewhere deep in the walls, that I'd never noticed before. These were tiny, normal-sounding things on their own, but together they made the night feel wrong in a way I couldn't label. After the pen incident, I went downstairs and told my coworker about it, and he shrugged and said the camera probably didn't catch anything because he hadn't been looking. He offered the usual practical explanations. A loose pen on a cart? Someone leaning out and whipping it? Or a weak gust from the elevator? I wanted to buy those explanations. I checked everything I could think of in the hallway on my own. I peered into the rooms with the peephole, inspected beneath doors to see if anything had been pushed out, and even pulled the laundry cart a little further to see if a pen might have been lodged under the edge and flicked by vibration. Nothing. The pen lay on the door where it had hit, scuffed and ordinary, like any cheap hotel pen. No fingerprints, no smear, nothing to suggest someone had been standing on the other side throwing things. It was just there. That night replayed through my head on the drive home. I imagined scenarios to make myself feel safe. Maybe a mouse knocked it from a shelf, maybe a pipe rattled and sent something airborne. I tried to remember if I'd been tired, if my nerves were frayed from the monotony of nights alone. Those are the rational things you tell yourself, but I kept circling back to how clearly I had seen the pen fly past my head and how perfectly silent the hall had been. Hotel doors make noise. People make noise. Even mechanical things make noise. But nothing made a sound that night. Over the next weeks, I kept an eye out for anything else, half expecting some pattern to show up. There were no other incidents, no floating items, no shadows darting, nothing. It was the one sharp, strange thing that cut through months of otherwise ordinary nights. That's what makes it hard to explain away. If it had been a prank or a loose item, you expect repetition or someone to fess up, or at least another sign. Nothing came. I left that job after 8 months, moved on to something different, but I still think about that pen more than seems reasonable. Not because it was terrifying, but because it was so small and so obviously unaccounted for. It's the kind of thing that sits in your head and nudges at you when you're lying awake. People have offered their own reads, drafts, pranks, a trick of the eyes, a loose screw somewhere, a guest with a strange sense of humor. Those are all possibilities. The part I can't make tidy is the combination of absolute silence and the pen's clear, fast arc across empty air. It didn't roll, it didn't fall, it flew like it had been thrown. I never found out who, if anyone, threw it. I never found a prankster or an explanation. For me, that single small event was enough to stop taking the night shift lightly. Even now, I picture that hallway whenever I think about working alone at night. It's a reminder that sometimes the world hands you a small loose end and hands you no explanation for why it was tossed your way. Story 4. The place always smelled a little like old shoes and stale grease, like a memory you keep of a Friday night you can't quite wash out. That's what the bowling alley felt like after hours. Rows of lanes sitting like tired soldiers, the score monitors dark, the ball returns silent. I worked the closing shift for a while after school, and by the time the last lane emptied, I knew the routine so well I could do it half asleep. Sweep the approach, top off the ball return, hit the lights, lock the doors, and head home. That night, everything started exactly like it should have. I finished the last lane, flipped the main breakers, and walked the back aisle by habit to make sure the machinery was quiet and the gutters were clear. The place hummed with the leftover heat of a night full of people, music, and cheap pizza. Nothing felt wrong. Little things had been off earlier that week, tiny building annoyances that I'd shrugged at, a flicker in the neon sign out front, a scoring screen that rebooted itself once during a busy frame, a line of bowling pins that hadn't reset perfectly one night and made us laugh it off as a jam. Those were the kind of things you expect with old equipment. On their own, they're just frustrating, but they add up in your head. That night, there was an extra small detail that stuck with me. When I went to check the service closet, the fluorescent bulb above the door buzzed a little louder than usual, and the door handle felt colder than a metal should. I remember thinking it odd, but I told myself it was probably the draft. I was locking up and about to leave when one of the lanes lit up all by itself. Not the faint emergency glow, but the whole lane. Approach lights, pin setter ready, the little overhead monitors flickering to life and displaying the default attract screen. That shouldn't happen unless someone at the control panel in the back switched it on. Our lane switches were manual and had to be flipped right there. There wasn't any automatic system to do it for us. I stood frozen for a second, expecting some clerk or late guest to pop out and laugh, but the place was silent. No shoes clacking on the approach, no laughter, nothing. I started walking down the side to the scoring area because that's what you do. You flip it off and move on. As I walked, the lane glowed like someone had turned a flashlight on under the floorboards. I remember thinking about the customer who'd left a bag by lane 3 earlier. Maybe they'd come back, but the bag was gone, and there were no footprints or signs of anyone. The ball return was empty. The lane's pins were set in a perfect triangle, like it was waiting for a bowler who would never come. I reached the curtain that separates the front house from the mechanics and pushed it aside to go behind the lanes and hit the switch. The air behind the curtain is always different, colder and smellier, oil and machine grease and old wood. Just as I stepped through, everything went dark again. The lane had shut off on its own, the lights dying as cleanly as if someone had flipped the switch from the control panel. I paused, heart thudding, because the timing was too perfect. If someone had turned it on as a joke, they would have waited until I was closer. If wind or a breaker had tripped, the whole alley would have flicked, not just one lane. I stood there listening to the motors whir that usually go unnoticed until they stop. Nothing else happened. No movement, no footsteps, not even the hum of the snack bar's cooler, which usually leaks into that space. My skin crawled a little in that quiet. I went back around to the front like a good employee and checked the lane again from the seating area to make sure I hadn't dreamed it. The lane was off, normal and unremarkable. I flipped the house lights on and did a quick sweep, looking for any pranksters who might have been hiding. There was no one. No chairs moved, no trash out of place. Everything was exactly where it should be. The next day, I told my boss what happened. He shrugged and said machines act odd, especially in old buildings, and suggested maybe a loose wire or a haunted circuit. He laughed at the haunted bit, the way someone does when they want to be funny but don't actually believe it. He also said the camera system had been out on that side of the building for weeks, which is why there was no footage. I wish we'd had cameras that night. I asked near the lanes if anyone had seen anything on their way out, and a couple of regulars joked that the pins bow to a higher power while no one's watching. That kind of shrug made me more unsettled than anything. If you're looking for the ordinary answer, people will hand it to you like a menu, and you have to pick from the items it lists. I kept thinking of the small things afterward. The flicker in the front neon, the scoring screen that rebooted earlier in the week, the bulging seam in the curtain fabric that had looked like someone might be resting against it, though when I checked, it was just a fold. None of it proved anything, but together they formed a breadcrumb trail leading to that one clear, weird moment. A lane that shouldn't have turned on and then turned itself off the second I stepped into the back. I started taking the long way to my car after that, checking over my shoulder, and found myself patting my pockets for keys I already had. The job didn't feel dangerous, no things chasing me, but it felt like there was a presence in the building that didn't belong to staff or customers. It was patient, waiting for the lights to go out. Over time, the story became one of those small local legends. Some co-workers swore they'd had odd things happen too. Music coming from the jukebox when it was unplugged, the ball return starting by itself. But those were second-hand tales, hard to verify. I left that job after a season and never saw anything else so clear. I sometimes wish someone had a camera still running to show me what actually happened, because part of me wants the neat answer. Wind, wires, prank. The other part remembers the way the lane lit up and the pins stood perfect in their triangle, like someone had set a stage and then left the lights on for a show with no audience. Whatever it was small and precise and left no sign but a memory. I still think about it when I pass a bowling alley at night, the rows of lanes dark and orderly, and I wonder how many quiet places have little acts like that that never get explained. Story 5. Museums are supposed to feel safe, like places where knowledge sits still under glass. That's what I always believed when I took the job as executive director at a family science museum. I used to run a family science museum, which mostly meant handling budgets, events, and staff schedules. Nothing about the job prepared me for late-night calls about alarms going off in one of the creepiest exhibits we ever hosted. We had rented a cadaver display, similar to Body World's, with human specimens carefully preserved and arranged in dramatic poses. It was supposed to be educational, and during the day it was fascinating. but at night it felt like walking into a hall full of corpses staring at you. The first time the security company called, I figured it was nothing serious. The motion detectors had gone off inside the exhibit hall, but none of the exterior sensors showed signs of a break-in. My job required me to check it out in person, so I got out of bed, drove 20 minutes to the museum, and walked in through the staff entrance with my flashlight in hand. The rest of the building was quiet, no broken doors or windows. When I reached the exhibit, my stomach turned. It wasn't just a room, it was like walking into a silent theater where the actors had been dead for decades. The figures were posed in ways that looked normal in daylight, running, playing chess, even holding instruments. But under my flashlight, they looked wrong. Every shadow made their muscles twitch, their hollow eye sockets glared back at me, and for a few seconds I had the awful thought that they would start moving if I stood there long enough. I made myself walk the entire perimeter of the hall, every row, every corner, telling myself it was just a false alarm. Nothing was out of place. 2 weeks later, the phone rang again around 3 a.m. Same story. Interior motion detectors triggered in the cadaver exhibit, but no signs of entry. I cursed under my breath, pulled my clothes on, and drove back down. This time, the unease hit me before I even walked inside. The air in the building was thick, stale, like a hospital corridor that hadn't been used in years. The motion alarm lights were still flashing on the panel, so I knew the sensors had gone off. Again, I forced myself into the exhibit hall. The strange part was the smell, stronger than before, like chemicals and something faintly sour, almost like old blood. These bodies weren't supposed to decompose, they were plasticated, but the smell clung to my nostrils as I walked through. I shone the flashlight on each figure and swore one of them looked like it had been moved slightly. A man posed mid-run, leaning forward, seemed to be facing a different angle than I remembered. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks. I cleared the room, locked up, and went home. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The third call came a month later, and by then I dreaded answering the phone. Again, interior motion alarms in the cadaver exhibit. This time, when I arrived, the building felt colder than it should have been. I stepped into the exhibit with my flashlight and froze almost immediately. The running man figure, the same one I thought had shifted before, was facing me directly. His plasticated lips stretched back in something like a smile. Or maybe that was just how his face had always been. But I could have sworn his posture was different. The worst part was the sound. Somewhere deeper in the hall, I heard a faint scuffing noise, like bare feet sliding against tile. I spun the light in that direction, but of course nothing was there. I walked the floor, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every time I passed a figure, I felt the weight of their empty sockets following me. I kept telling myself it was just nerves. The alarm was probably faulty, maybe even a rat or a bug tripping the sensors. But that sound of movement, I couldn't shake it. When I finally made it to the far end of the hall, I turned back toward the exit. The beam of my flashlight swept across the specimens, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw one tilt its head toward me, like it was acknowledging I'd intruded. My whole body went cold. I rushed through the last of the checks, signed off with the alarm company, and locked up. Driving home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those figures in the back seat. Of course, nothing was there. Looking back, I still don't have an explanation. Maybe the alarms were faulty. Maybe exhaustion made me imagine more than what was actually happening. But even now, years later, I can still remember the feeling of being watched in that hall full of lifeless bodies. It wasn't the kind of fear you can laugh off after the fact. It was the kind that sticks to you, that makes you wonder if those figures were really as lifeless as they appeared. I never told anyone at the museum the full story. On paper, I wrote the incidents off as technical errors. But deep down, I'll always remember those nights and how I walked through a room of the dead, never quite sure if I was the only living thing in there. Story 6. My memory of what happened that night is like a cheap flashlight you keep in a junk drawer, bright for a second, then flickering until you strain to see anything at all. I was working the graveyard restock shift for a moving company, the kind of job that chews you up and spits you out if you let it. The trucks came in at odd hours, the docks smelled like diesel and pizza, and the work was the same ugly loop every night. Pull supplies, load bins, check lists. Try not to think about how little you were getting paid. I'd done the job long enough to be numb to most of it, and that night I was tired in a way that made everything feel soft around the edges, like someone had put gauze over my eyes. I had a truck backed up to the dock and was half inside stacking straps and blankets when I noticed my vision go weird. At first I blamed the long day and the heat. My eyelids felt heavy. But the fuzziness wasn't the usual blur of fatigue. It felt like something crawling at the edge of my sight. I rubbed my eyes and my forearm came away wet, sticky in a way that made me grimace. I told myself it was sweat, the kind that collects under work shirts during late shifts, and kept moving. Then it happened again. The same muffled haze, the same wet smear on my skin. Only this time, when I pulled my hand away slowly and looked, really looked, I realized the wetness wasn't sweat at all. My forearm was covered in tiny crushed bodies, like someone had rolled a handful of pepper across my skin and squashed it flat. My first thought was disgust, then confusion, then an instinctive, stupid hope that maybe it was dirt or plant matter from the pallet. But I kept blinking, and more of the tiny things came into focus. They were baby spiders, hundreds of them, flattened where they had met my arm and clustered along the cuff of my sleeve. For a second, my brain tried to reject what I was seeing, told me I was hallucinating from exhaustion, told me all the usual rational things. Then I felt a tickle at my lashes, and it hit me. I wasn't seeing anything wrong. Small legs were brushing the inside of my eyelids. Panic is a strange, physical thing. It makes your chest hollow and your hands clumsy, like you can't move them fast enough to catch up with your thoughts. I stumbled back out of the truck, the light catching the mass of tiny legs moving across my face, and slapped at my eyes and nose and mouth until my palms were full of tiny, writhing bodies. My first smart move was to get to the hose. The dock area had a hose used for rinsing out the trucks and washing down the floor. I grabbed it and turned it on full blast, splashing water over my head and shoulders until I was soaked through. The water knocked most of them off, but not all. Some clung like lint or like static, stubborn and alive. I stayed there under that spray for a long time, until my arms were pruned and my shirt was a heavy, cold thing against my skin. I sat on the bumper of the truck and tried to count breaths and tell myself it was over. The problem with moments like that is that they change a person's sense of safety on the spot. Before, the world had been ordinary and bearable. Afterward, every crack in the loading bay, every shadowed pallet, felt like it could hide the thing that had sat in my eyelashes. The next morning, I woke with a bunch of tiny red bites on my legs, several of them grouped together in little clusters. They itched like hell. I took photos and sent them to a coworker, half joking about quitting, half wondering if I'd need a tetanus shot. The bites swelled a little and left a pattern of angry dots, but otherwise I was fine. No fever, no allergic reaction, just a creeping sense that whatever had happened was not quite explainable away by a bad nest in the truck. People like neat causes. We like to pin a label on things and move on. My first rational chain was the easiest. The truck must have been infested. Maybe some mother spider had chosen the warm upholstery as a nursery, laid hundreds of eggs in the seam of a bench or under a seat, and overnight the babies hatched in a pulse. That could explain the mass of tiny spiders in the bites, and it fit with the job, with the truck sitting in and out of lots of different houses, picking up hitchhikers from attics and basements. I told myself that, and for a little while it helped, but there were details that didn't sit right. For one, the way they were on me felt targeted, not accidental. They crawled up my arms, across my face, even lodged in my lashes like something about me drew them in. If a nest had burst inside the truck, you would expect them to scatter to find shelter in the upholstery, not clamber all over one single person who was simply restocking the truck. Also, the coloration of the babies was off for the species we usually saw around the docks. These were pale, almost translucent, with tiny darker heads. Not the dark brown yard spiders I'd stepped over for years. Finally, when I came back later that afternoon to check the truck with one of the other guys, we found nothing. No nest, no egg sac, no trail of adults. It looked clean, like nothing had ever been there. I tried to make sense of it by checking online forums and pest control sites. I read about spider blooms and mass hatchings, about species that lay eggs in large clusters and then disperse, and some of it matched. One guy on a forum told a story about baby spiders raining down in a greenhouse after a sudden shift in humidity. Another pest control tech said sometimes babies emerge and cluster on the warm skin of animals until the surface cools, then they scatter. Those explanations helped my sleep for a week, but they didn't erase the image of those tiny legs in my eyelashes, or the way I'd felt watched for days afterward. There's a smaller, harder to explain part of the memory. For the next month, every time I closed my eyes, I could feel a phantom sensation in the corner of my vision, like something tiny crawling under my skin. Even when there was nothing there, I scratched at my forearms in reflex, like I hadn't finished clearing them. Little things in my apartment, loose threads, a speck of lint, started giving me the creeps. I kept telling myself it was stress, that my brain had rewired itself around that experience and was now primed to overreact. Rationally, that's probably true, but the emotional part of it kept nudging at another possibility. What if whatever happened that night had been less about a nest and more about something that selected me? I still work the docks because people need money and shifting careers isn't easy. I wear long sleeves now, and I always check the trucks before I climb in. I bring wipes and a spare shirt for the hose, and I avoid that particular truck when I can. When friends laugh and say it's just a spider story, I shrug and play along. But on quiet nights, when the lights hum and the trucks sit like sleeping beasts, I can't help thinking back to that moment and wondering whether the world sometimes throws these tiny, intimate horrors at you just to see how you'll react. Was it a nest, a bad luck coincidence, or something stranger, something that found me and chose to crawl up into my eyelashes like a reminder that there are still things in the dark that will make you run? I don't know, and maybe I never will. All I know is I don't want to find out again. Story 7. My memory of that night sticks to me the way a greasy handprint clings to glass. Clear, stubborn, and impossible to ignore. And the whole thing started with the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound too loud. I was working as a healthcare assistant on the night shift, doing my rounds the way I'd been trained. Quick checks at each door, a gentle peek inside, sometimes switching on the nightlight for a second, just to make sure everyone was breathing and settled. It was the kind of job where you get used to small surprises, but that night the building felt off from the moment I clocked in. The hall lights hummed in a lower tone than usual, and the common room TV that usually played soft music was dead silent. I told myself it was nothing and kept walking, cart in hand, checking beds, straightening a blanket here, adjusting a pillow there, letting the routine soothe the nagging feeling at the base of my skull. Halfway down the corridor, I saw her, sitting up at the edge of her bed in the doorway, in a way that should have been impossible for her. I knew her file, full assist, needed help with everything, not one of those residents who got up on their own. But she was upright, feet nearly touching the floor, head down like she was staring at her hands. And the way the moonlight through the window carved her silhouette made her look too thin, like someone had folded paper into the shape of a person. When I called out to check if she needed anything, it felt normal to me at first, like the usual check-in, but then everything sped up inside my chest. She lifted her head slowly, and the motion was wrong, like a puppet jerking on strings. Her neck turned in the small increments. Her gaze rose and fixed on me, and she kept eye contact in a way that wasn't sleepy or confused. The way she looked at me made me step back a little. Her eyes were blank but intense, lined and old, and when she spoke, it came out as a hoarse whisper that felt like it scraped the air. She made it clear she was saying someone named Helen who was no longer here, and the tone was accusation and sorrow folded together. I didn't hear the words as a normal sentence. I felt them land like pebbles in a still pond. My skin crawled. It didn't help that the hallway seemed to hold its breath at the same moment. The usual clatter from the nurse's station was muted. The distant echo of a cart never came, and even the usual smell of antiseptic seemed diluted. That silence was the first small sign that something was not right. I ran to the nursing station, heart banging, breath ragged, and I reported what had happened. The nurse on duty at first laughed it off in a nervous way and told me the resident was practically immobile, barely verbal, and that she had never once been seen sitting at the edge of the bed like that. It sounded like what you expect from someone trying to calm a junior staffer, like the professional version of, "Don't worry about it," but she agreed to come with me anyway, which should have settled me down. We moved quickly back down the corridor. The carpet muffled our steps, and the lights seemed dimmer than they had been when I first walked past. I remember thinking the walk took longer than it should have, and wondering if the building had somehow stretched around us, which is the kind of silly thought your brain grabs when it's trying to make sense of fear. When we pushed the door open, the bed was empty and the room looked ordinary at first glance. Neatly tucked sheets, slippers in place, the faint whir of the oxygen concentrator. But the sense of wrongness didn't leave me. I peered around the bed, checked the wardrobe in the bathroom, and then the nurse went to the window and said the same thing we did when we walked in. The resident was lying down, tucked in, snoring softly like someone who'd been asleep for hours. Not a single muscle was out of place. No sign she'd been up at all. I felt that combination of relief and a cold edge in my stomach that you get when a puzzle has one piece that doesn't match. I tried to explain what I had seen. I told them about her sitting at the edge of the bed, about the way her head moved, about the voice saying the one name. The nurse offered a practical list of possibilities. Maybe I saw a shadow. Maybe she had attempted to sit up earlier and settled back down before we arrived. Maybe medication or a lucid dream had made her confused, and she spoke a name aloud. Those were reasonable. I am not the sort of person to ignore facts. I checked the bed rails, the call bell, the sensor pads, everything that would show movement, and they were all in order. The nurse said the motion sensor hadn't registered anything unusual. That was the second odd sign. The building's tech, which usually caught every little movement, showed nothing. It should have at least pinged once when the resident shifted. Instead, it showed an uninterrupted sleep pattern for the entire hour. After I left the room and finished my rounds, I couldn't get the image out of my head. I kept replaying how her neck turned and how that name landed. The next day, I checked the resident's chart and saw notes from months ago about an old friend named Helen, someone she had been close to before dementia took hold. Staff had written about how the name popped up sometimes in her sleep, how she would call for Helen and then fall back into silence. The clinical explanation made sense, but it didn't erase the sense of urgency I felt that night. It didn't explain why she'd been sitting up when her body shouldn't have allowed it, or why the sensors had shown nothing. The gap between the technology's record and my memory felt unnerving. Over the next few weeks, small things kept cropping up. A tray I had set on the bedside table was slightly askew the next morning, though I'd been certain it was straight. The radio in the common room, which someone swore they'd turned off, came on by itself to static at odd hours. Colleagues started sharing stories about residents waking at night and calling out names, about shadows seen in the doorway, about equipment that beeped with no apparent cause. They were the kind of stories you trade late over coffee that are half jokey and half the things that won't leave your mind. I tried to hold to the rational thread. Dementia, sleepwalking, faulty sensors, the acoustics of an old building. Those things fit. Still, when I walked past that residence room after my shift, the corridor sometimes seemed to breathe, like the walls expanded so the light thinned, and I would find my steps slowing as if something in the doorway was watching me. The fear was subtle at first, then it cut deeper. I started double-checking rooms I had already checked, peeking in the windows, tapping the rails as if to confirm that the bodies I looked at were solid and not illusions. I told myself that I was telling the story because it was my job to notice the weird stuff and report it, not because I believed I'd seen anything supernatural. But the memory keeps other details with it. The particular rasp in her voice that couldn't be explained by a throat or a cough, the precise angle her head had turned, and that blank gaze that seemed to hold a message instead of just confusion. I still reach for rational explanations, and I still think the most likely answer is a combination of delirium and memory tricks in a building full of sleepers. Yet sometimes, late on my drive home, I will picture that woman sitting at the edge of the bed, saying that Helen was gone, and I will feel that same animal prickling along my skin. Maybe it was dementia and a dream moved her body. Maybe it was a sensor error, but the unease remains. That single impossible image was enough to make me check every door twice after that night. And the way the hall seemed to hold its breath lingers in me like a warning I can't quite name. Story 8. Some jobs leave you with memories you can laugh about later. Others leave you with memories you wish you could forget. Delivering pizzas at night during college fell into the second category for me. It wasn't just the shady neighborhoods or the late hours. It was the way the city seemed different after dark. Streets I walked in the daytime without a second thought became stretches of shadow where every flickering streetlight made me nervous. Our shop was the only one in town that would deliver to the rougher areas, so I was always the guy hauling pizza boxes through stairwells that smelled like mold, past apartments where screaming or breaking glass didn't even make the neighbors blink. I'd gotten used to keeping my head down, moving fast, and not asking questions. But there was one place that never felt normal, no matter how many times I went there. The old psychiatric hospital on the edge of town. It was massive. Part hospital, part halfway house, part locked ward. The first time I got a call from them, I thought it was a prank, but it wasn't. They ordered big, sometimes enough that I had to make multiple trips through their security checkpoint and up the creaking elevators. The whole place smelled like disinfectant layered over something rotten, like the building itself was sick. What really made my skin crawl were the people. Some patients were allowed to roam the lobby or sit in the lounge areas. They didn't talk to me, but they watched. Always watched. Eyes following me as I carried the boxes, heads tilted at unnatural angles, expressions that never seemed to change. Behind some locked doors, I'd catch glimpses of faces pressed up against the reinforced glass. No sound, just wide eyes staring. Sometimes they were smiling in a way that didn't look human. One night, I had 3 trips worth of food to bring inside. On my second trip, as I was coming back down the hallway, I heard the sound of feet shuffling behind me. Not fast, just slow, dragging steps, like someone was being careful not to get too close. I turned and the hall was empty, but I swear I saw a shape slip around the corner at the far end. I told myself it was just a patient out late and ignored it. On the third trip, the security guard at the front desk looked uneasy when I came through. He didn't say much, just gave me a strange look, like he wanted to warn me about something but couldn't. When I stepped out of the elevator onto the patient floor, the air felt heavier, almost like the building was holding its breath. The hall was darker than usual. Some of the overhead lights flickered on and off. I walked past a row of doors, each with a tiny window. Most were dark inside, but one had someone standing just behind the glass. They weren't moving, just watching me walk past. I looked back once, and they were still there, eyes fixed on me, like they knew something I didn't. My skin crawled. When I reached the lounge area, it was empty, which was unusual. Normally, there were a few patients sitting there. I set the pizzas on the counter and called out for staff, but no one answered. That's when I heard it, a low, muffled laugh echoing down the hallway I just come from. It wasn't loud, but it carried, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The lights flickered again, and for just a second, I thought I saw movement, something crawling low across the hallway before disappearing into the shadows. By the time the staff finally came out to collect the order, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely sign the receipt. They acted like nothing was wrong, but I swear they avoided making eye contact with me, almost like they knew I'd heard or seen something I wasn't supposed to. On the way out, I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel it again, the weight of someone staring. When I passed the row of doors again, the window where I'd seen the figure earlier was now empty. But as I stepped into the elevator, I caught a reflection in the glass. A pale face in the hallway, smiling as the doors slid shut. I never told anyone at work about what I saw that night. I kept delivering there when orders came in, but I never took the elevator alone again, and I never looked too long into those windows. You could say it was just my imagination, or maybe a patient messing with me. But deep down, I know what I felt. That place wasn't just filled with people. Something else lived in those halls, and it knew I didn't belong there. Story 9. Some places have a way of feeling wrong, no matter how familiar you are with them. For me, that place is one of the smaller water treatment plants I cover on my shifts. It's tucked out on the edge of town, surrounded by nothing but fields and an old tree line that swallows the horizon. During the day, it looks ordinary, like a small industrial block with a fence around it. At night, though, it feels like the world outside shrinks away until it's just you, the humming machinery, and whatever else might be watching. I'd been working night shifts there long enough to know the routine. Check the panels, walk the perimeter, monitor the chemical levels. Nothing special, but that plant had quirks. The MCC panels inside were never quiet. They didn't just hum like at other plants, they clicked and chattered constantly. If you stood near them long enough, you'd swear you could make out words like faint conversations bleeding through the walls. The first time I noticed it, I laughed it off as my brain looking for patterns. But after dozens of nights, I couldn't ignore that it always sounded like a group of people whispering, just out of reach. The fog was the worst part. The plant sat in a low dip, so whenever the temperature dropped, a thick blanket of mist would roll in. Sometimes it was so dense I couldn't see the fence 10 feet away from the control building. One night, I stepped outside to grab something from my truck, and as I shut the door behind me, I caught movement in the fog. Two shapes walked out of it, low to the ground, deliberate. My first thought was dogs, but when they stopped at the glass door and I saw the thin frames and glowing eyes, I realized they were coyotes. They didn't act like normal animals, though. They just stood there side by side, peering through the glass at me. They didn't growl, didn't move, didn't even blink. Just stared. My hand hovered near my radio because the longer it went on, the less they felt like animals at all. Eventually, without a sound, they both turned in unison and disappeared back into the fog. It left me rattled for the rest of the night. I told myself it was nothing, just scavengers passing through, but I couldn't shake how unnatural it felt. That wasn't the only weird thing. Another night, while making my usual round, I noticed something strange about the floor near the chemical tanks. Out of the corner of my eye, it looked like the concrete itself was shifting, like ripples in water. When I focused, I realized it wasn't the floor moving. It was dozens of tiny frogs crawling all over each other. They were everywhere, spreading across the plant floor like the ground itself had come alive. It wasn't just gross, it was unnerving. Every step I took risked crushing one, and the sound they made when that happened, sharp, wet pops, echoed in the building. I tried sweeping them out, but more kept slipping in from cracks I hadn't noticed. They covered the place for hours before suddenly disappearing as if they'd never been there. By the morning, I couldn't find a single one. Things escalated when I went to check the chemical feed room later that same week. It was a part of the plant I always hated going into because it felt cut off from everything else. As soon as I opened the door, I froze. A massive wolf spider, easily the size of my hand, was crouched in the corner with a frog caught in its fangs. I'd seen big spiders before, but this one felt out of proportion to reality. The way it fed, slow and deliberate, was so revolting I had to back out and catch my breath. After that night, I started noticing more things that didn't add up. Doors that I was sure I'd locked would be standing open when I circled back. Tools I'd set down would vanish, only to turn up hours later in another part of the plant. Once, while making notes at the console, I caught a shadow move across the wall in front of me. The problem was that the only light source was behind me, and nothing was there to cast it. The worst was when the whispers from the MCC panels grew louder. Normally, they blended into the background, but one night I swore I heard my name mixed in. I froze, straining my ears, and the voices shifted back into unintelligible chatter. I told myself I was tired, that night shifts do strange things to your brain, but I can't pretend it didn't chill me to the bone. Over time, the plant became a place I dreaded. Nothing ever happened during the day, and if I brought it up to anyone else, they brushed it off as night shift nerves. But being alone there for hours at a time, surrounded by fog, animals acting wrong, frogs appearing out of nowhere, and whispers that seemed too close to be mechanical. I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't the only one working those nights. The logical part of me wants to believe it was all explainable. The coyotes were just scavengers. The frogs had some natural reason for showing up. The spider was a freak encounter. And the MCC chatter was my brain making sense of random noise. But the other part of me, the one that still feels uneasy every time I drive past that plant, thinks I brushed against something I wasn't supposed to. Even now, when I look back on those shifts, I can't decide what unsettled me more, the things I saw and heard, or the fact that nobody else seemed to experience them. Story 10. Working nights is a strange thing on its own. The world feels half asleep, and you start to notice little details you'd missed during the day. Every hum of the heater, every flicker of the fluorescent lights, Every creak of the building feels louder, heavier. When I worked the overnight shift at a drug rehab program, those small details sometimes built into something more unsettling than I was prepared for. From the start, other staff had warned me, not in a dramatic ghost story kind of way, but in that casual, half-joking tone people use when they're saying something that feels silly, but they actually believe. They mentioned seeing shapes in the hallways, hearing whispers, and most of all, avoiding one particular room because patients and staff alike swore weird things always happened there. I chalked it up to superstition at first. This was a rehab, after all, where people went through withdrawals, hallucinations, and sleepless nights. Strange claims weren't exactly rare in that environment. Still, the consistency of the stories made me keep the warnings tucked away in the back of my mind. That one room was a problem spot. Clients who stayed in it complained about waking up paralyzed, unable to move or scream, convinced something was sitting on their chest. I'd read about sleep paralysis, so I didn't think too much of it. But I did notice the way the temperature in that room never made sense. In the middle of winter, with the heat blasting, I could walk into that room and feel an icy draft brush against me. It wasn't dramatic, just a chill that stuck around long enough to make me feel like I shouldn't linger. One night during my rounds, I came up to that door. Routine check, nothing unusual. As I reached for the handle, I noticed something strange. The knob was moving. Not violently, not like someone was panicking, but gently twisting, the way you'd expect if someone inside was trying to come out quietly. I stepped back, figuring it was just a restless client needing air or a cigarette. It wasn't uncommon for people to wander at night, and my first instinct was to give whoever it was a second to come through. The knob turned all the way, the latch clicked, and the door creaked open. I shifted my weight, expecting someone to step into the hallway. Instead, nothing. The door opened halfway and just stopped. No one stood there. The bed inside was in full view, sheets tucked tight, undisturbed. The angle of the room meant there was no way a person could have opened the door and slipped back in without me seeing it. I froze, my brain scrambling for a reasonable explanation. Maybe I'd missed someone ducking under the bed. Maybe a draft had somehow pushed it open. But the image of that knob turning on its own burned into my head. I pushed the door fully open and scanned the room. Empty. Cold air clung to the space, more than usual, like walking into a walk-in freezer compared to the rest of the hall. The heater was humming just as loud as everywhere else, but it wasn't making a difference. I checked under the bed, the closet, even pressed my hand against the windows to make sure none had been left open. Everything was in place. No patient, no trick. Just that heavy silence that makes your ears ring. I told myself I'd imagined it. Stress, sleep deprivation, suggestion from all the ghost stories I'd been fed. But the thing that stuck with me was how physical it felt. The weight of the knob shifting, the resistance of the latch releasing. That wasn't something you could dream up or confuse. It had happened. The rest of the shift dragged. Every time I walked past that door again, I felt like something was waiting behind it, just out of sight. Other staff swore the room had a history. Some said patients complained of voices calling their names at night. Others claimed to see shadows crossing the doorway when the room was empty. Most of the clients who spent more than a night in there refused to stay long, always requesting transfers. I can't say with certainty what I experienced. Maybe there was a mechanical issue with the knob, though I'd never seen it happen before or after. Maybe my brain exaggerated the whole thing because I was primed to expect something odd in that particular room. But I'll be honest, when the door opened on its own and no one was standing there, my stomach dropped in a way that doesn't come from faulty equipment. That was the night I stopped brushing off the stories. Before then, I figured people exaggerated, maybe made things up to scare new staff. After that, I started paying more attention. I noticed the sudden drops in temperature, the footsteps that didn't match anyone's patrol, the way patients who'd never spoken to each other repeated the same claims about whispers or shadows. It's been years since I worked that job, but I still think about that door opening on its own. You can find ways to explain almost anything, and I've tried, but I'll never be able to shake how certain I was in that moment that something on the other side wanted to step through, only it never showed itself.